Before we begin the recording, please note that we have made a correction to clarify that the page limit for expressions of interest is 10 pages, not 8 pages as was mentioned in the live session.
Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar to learn more about ERA's $50 million Circular Economy Challenge. My name is Isabella Tarasco. I am the Manager of Strategic Initiatives and Programs for Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA. Today, I am joined by Steve MacDonald, our CEO, Mark Summers, our Chief Strategy Officer, and Justin Wheler, our Executive Director of Technology and Innovation. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to say that ERA respectfully acknowledges that our ERA office in Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for diverse Indigenous peoples. Before we get to the agenda, I'd like to start by going through a few housekeeping items just to make sure we get the most of our time today. First of all, we're expecting quite a few participants today, so everyone's microphone is muted to avoid unintentional background noise. If you encounter technical challenges related to the webinar connection, please email Amanda at info@eralberta.ca and we'll try to help you out. However, if you can't resolve your technical issues or if you need to leave early, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on our website. It will be uploaded on our webpage for the Circular Economy Challenge, which is linked off our homepage and on our funding page. The recording will include both the presentation and the live Q&A with audio. In terms of agenda for today, we have 1 hour together. First, Steve will share a few introductory remarks, and Mark will talk briefly about ERA and our mandate. Next, Justin will provide an overview of the Circular Economy Challenge that was announced on March 30th. We'll cover some key points regarding scope and eligibility for the call, the submission process, and the timelines around the funding decision. We'll also provide advice for anyone who is interested in making a submission. And finally, we'll end off by answering some of your questions. So, if you have any questions and you would like us to address them about the application process, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel as we go. We will answer as many as we can, but if we don't address your question, you're welcome to follow up with us afterwards. And so with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to our CEO, Steve MacDonald.
Thank you, Isabella, and good morning, everyone. We know the world needs a more circular economy to deliver on its net zero ambition. Actions, such as improving energy efficiency and fuel switching, will get us only part of the way there. Accelerating a circular economy will help us get all of the way there. This challenge will advance solutions that reduce waste, decrease the consumption of raw materials, and restore natural systems. Currently, our economic systems follow a straight line. We take the natural resources we need to make the products we use, and we throw them away as waste. We need to bend this take, make, waste system around. And the concept of circularity is not new. Indigenous communities have been practicing it for generations. By rethinking our economic models, we are not just improving our environment, we are also unlocking enormous new potential. The circular economy is expected to generate $4.5 trillion of economic growth by 2030. It will make supply chains stronger, reduce emissions, create jobs, and add to the overall competitiveness of our companies. Achieving a more circular economy is a complex challenge. It requires systemic change, cross-sector innovation, and behavioral shifts. The $50 million investment from the Government of Alberta's Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Fund will help protect the environment, keep Albertans working, and meet broader ESG goals and net zero targets. This challenge will help us actively seek out and accelerate the most promising technologies to support the new circular economy. And with that, I'll hand things over to Mark.
Thanks, Steve and Isabella. I assume most folks listening in know who ERA is, but as a quick refresher, since 2009, we've invested proceeds from Alberta's carbon pricing system for large industrial emitters with the ultimate goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions toward net zero and simultaneously strengthening the competitiveness of Alberta's industrial sector. That's both new and existing industries in the province. More specifically, our funding comes from large emitter facilities in the province who are subject to Alberta's tier regulation and are required to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet regulated targets. As an independent not-for-profit, accountable to the government, we offer a clearly defined and transparent line of sight from these funds to the technology innovation investments required to achieve this vision for Alberta. Our strategy is focused on 5 cross-cutting technology areas that span across Alberta's industrial sector and across timescales from near-term improvements to long-term transformational opportunities. Our focus areas include energy efficiency, future fuels, circular economy, which is the topic of today's conversation, industrial transformation, and carbon sequestration. Our investments are strategically driven by our technology roadmap, which articulates technology pathways that can lead Alberta toward a competitive economy with sustainable environmental outcomes, ongoing investment, and prosperity in a lower carbon world. Since our inception in 2009, we've now committed almost $800 million to support 220 projects, and we've been very fortunate and successful leveraging our investments with both private dollars and funding from our partnership network. These 220 projects represent a total investment of $6.5 billion, which will have a significant impact on the province. Our portfolio is estimated to deliver cumulative greenhouse gas reductions of 42 million tons by 2030 and create almost 32,000 person-year jobs by 2025 in the province of Alberta, as well as contribute $4.6 billion to our provincial GDP. Today, we're talking about our latest funding challenge, but I'd quickly like to point out that ERA has 3 ways to fund projects. We have challenges like this one, which involve a rigorous 2-stage competitive process. Our 3 most recent challenges are shown here, including our food, farming, and forestry challenge, our shovel-ready challenge, which led to our biggest funding announcement to date, and most recently, our carbon capture kickstart competition, which is underway now. We also have our partnership intake program and our energy savings for business program. If you'd like to learn more about these, please take a look at our website, eralberta.ca. And just before I turn things over to Justin, I want to take a minute to touch on our partnerships at ERA. Partnerships are critical to our success and to delivering on a complete solutions approach. Not only does working with our partners allow us to leverage funding and due diligence to share risk, as well as reduce administrative burden for applicants, it also provides a comprehensive support structure for innovation at various stages of technology development, commercialization, and market adoption. Our trusted partner network includes organizations within Alberta, with the federal government, across the country, and around the world. A handful of examples include Alberta Innovates, who we've been partnered with since ERA was created, Sustainable Development Technology Canada, or SDTC, Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, and also internationally with the Accelerating CCS Technologies Consortium, or ACT. With that, I'll hand things over to Justin, who will provide some details on our Circular Economy Challenge. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Mark. As you all know, we are committing $50 million through our Circular Economy Challenge to accelerate the province's transition towards a low emissions economy. This investment from the Government of Alberta through its Tier Fund is focused on advancing innovations that will reduce greenhouse gas impacts of material production, processing, and disposal, and support economic diversification. These technology solutions can contribute to widespread environmental, economic, and social benefits. Funding will accelerate the transition to a circular economy and keep valuable materials out of landfills and the environment, while driving investment in our province, increasing economic activity, creating jobs, and reducing emissions. We're seeking innovative projects that have the potential to deliver GHG benefits across the entire material value chain and cradle-to-cradle product lifecycle. We have up to $50 million available in total for this call, with up to $10 million per selected project and a minimum project request of $500,000. ERA will only match contributions toward eligible expenses on a one-to-one basis. As always, we're working in partnership with other funding organizations in Alberta and across Canada. In some cases, there may be an opportunity for us to share your proposal with trusted partners and explore possibilities to leverage funding available from these organizations. There's a place for applicants to give permission for this in our template. So who should apply? You can see a few examples on the screen here, but essentially it's wide open. We welcome applications that meet the criteria from innovators, technology developers, Indigenous communities, municipalities, industrial facility owners and operators, industry associations, small and medium enterprises, research and development organizations, universities, not-for-profit organizations, government research labs, and even individuals. I want to emphasize that partnerships are encouraged. Collaboration demonstrates opportunities for technology validation, commercialization, and sharing of results. Since this call is focused on advancing technology solutions, involvement from tech providers and/or developers is critical. Applicants are encouraged to partner with Alberta's postsecondary and research institutions, as well as Indigenous communities and municipalities where they can. These partnerships help attract and retain highly skilled workers, increase Alberta's innovation capacity, engage local communities, and leverage complementary resources. If you're proposing a project that will be deployed at an industrial facility, then having the facility operator as the applicant or a partner is important. Some examples of projects of interest include, but are not limited to, novel solutions for treatment and upcycling of wastewater or solid wastes, waste to value-added products, for example, upcycling of agriculture, forestry, construction, municipal, and mining wastes, advanced plastics recycling and circular plastics technologies, novel mineral sources such as lithium brines, carbonates, and high-value material extraction from waste streams or products such as tailings or fly ash, metals and minerals recycling and reuse, innovative solutions for agriculture or food waste reduction and/or upcycling, fertilizer production from waste, green building materials like hemp, novel forest products, novel cement chemistries, plastics, and more. Excuse me. Feedstock substitution, such as biogenic inputs, material recovery, and industrial symbiosis. Advanced manufacturing, including digitization and automation of product manufacturing and logistics, will also be considered. And finally, carbon dioxide conversion or utilization is also eligible. The guideline document also includes guidance on what is out of scope for this challenge. For example, waste to energy or biofuels projects are not eligible for this call. The challenge is open to new builds, retrofits, and projects that have previously been initiated but have stalled. For clarity, prior announcement or development of a project does not preclude it from receiving funding, but all applicants must justify how an ERA-funded project will lead to activities and developments that are additional to the business as usual case. Projects that have already received ERA or CCEMC funding are not eligible to receive further ERA funding for the same development. However, applicants may request support for a new phase of development that builds on and sufficiently advances a previously funded project. One last point here. Applicants must demonstrate how the proposed technology or application of technology is an innovative solution for emissions reduction in Alberta. First-of-kind demonstration of novel technology solutions, innovative adaptation of solutions that have been implemented outside of Alberta or in a different industry or sector, and novel configurations of commercial technologies are all eligible. This is not about business as usual technology. In terms of eligibility, I want to emphasize that at ERA we fund projects. By this, I mean there must be a clear scope, objectives, milestones, timelines, deliverables, and project budget. The goal is to take technology from point A to point B in terms of accelerating it towards commercialization. We do not fund ongoing operations or open-ended programs, such as a 5-year research program. Applicants must clearly delineate the scope of the project for which ERA funding is being requested and the GHG reduction potential associated with that scope of work. Any related work completed concurrently or before the project term, but outside the scope of the project, may be discussed in the proposal, but should be clearly indicated as such and will not be considered an eligible project cost. In this challenge, the maximum length of a project is 3 years from initiation, and successful applicants must commence work on the project within 120 days of funding approval. We are open to projects that involve field pilot, commercial demonstration, or first-of-kind commercial implementation of technologies. We know good ideas and good technology can come from anywhere, so applicants and technology providers can be from Alberta, Canada, or international. However, while technologies can come from anywhere in the world, projects must be piloted, demonstrated, or implemented here in Alberta. And of course, all projects funded through this call must demonstrate a clear value proposition for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Alberta. Projects must be able to show that they support both GHG reductions within the province and on a life cycle basis, i.e., a project can't just shift emissions to another jurisdiction. A few words on process. We often receive about 10 times more funding requests than we can support, so it's important that all applicants make a strong case for why your project should be funded. As you can see in the diagram, we have a two-stage evaluation process followed by execution of the project. In the expression of interest, or EOI stage, applicants are invited to provide an overview of their proposed project. An EOI is a relatively short document, 10 pages maximum, and must be submitted using our online system by the May 26th deadline. For fairness reasons, we will not extend the deadline and we will not accept late submissions. After all the EOIs have been submitted, they are evaluated by a team of independent experts. We bring together a team of evaluators with subject matter expertise in business, financing, science, engineering, and greenhouse gas quantification. After the EOI evaluation process, a short list of projects will be invited to submit a full project proposal, which includes more detail about the proposed project, the expected outcomes, and the implementation plan, including commercialization plan. A proposal advisor is assigned to each of the FPP applicants when the full proposal invitation is sent out. This advisor is available to help guide applicants through the process and provide feedback if requested for the full proposals and presentations while they are under development. After the FPPs are submitted, they are again evaluated by an independent team of experts, and all full proposal applicants will be invited to offer a presentation to the evaluation team. This process culminates with an in-depth review meeting where all projects are discussed in detail and a recommendation is developed and brought forward to our board for consideration. All final funding decisions are made by ERA's board of directors. The entire process is overseen by an independent fairness monitor that reports directly to the board of directors on the entire process. After the funding decisions are made, we enter into legal agreements with the successful applicants that detail the terms and obligations of each party as it relates to our contribution and the execution of the project. A project advisor is also assigned at that point to maintain our connection with the project throughout its execution. ERA's funding is distributed on a milestone-by-milestone basis, and the progress of each project is monitored and reported on throughout the course of the project. At the end of the project, all recipients are required to produce a final outcomes report, which is ultimately shared publicly for the broader benefit of Alberta. Further to my point about sharing final reports, information sharing is a key part of why we fund projects. Funding recipients will be required to report on project outcomes, achievements, and lessons learned. This includes GHG reductions, both actual and projected, job creation, and other environmental, economic, and social benefits. ERA is committed to encouraging widespread knowledge sharing from funded projects to maximize the benefits of our investment. This is an important component of our funding, to share knowledge and encourage broader and more informed decision-making on future investments. In addition to written reports, ERA may require recipients to participate in specific activities such as workshops and lesson learned events. I should add that we do have provisions to protect confidential information in this process. As for timelines, the deadline for submission of EOIs is May 26th at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. Projects that are shortlisted in the EOI phase will be notified by late July of this year and will have until mid-September to provide their full project proposals. FPP presentations will be scheduled shortly after the FPP deadline, and we'll notify applicants after our board meeting in December of the funding decisions. From there, successful applicants will enter into a contribution agreement with ERA that will address the project scope, payment schedule, monitoring and reporting requirements, terms of funding, and other aspects related to ERA's funding contribution. So last thing before the Q&A is just a few words of advice on preparing a successful submission. First, I would recommend that you start the process now. From now until the submission deadline, there are about 6 weeks, including a holiday this weekend. We know that it doesn't take 6 weeks to put together an application. However, it does take time to forge partnerships, get internal approvals, and allocate resources. While you don't need to have every internal approval or partnership finalized by the EOI submission deadline, the further along you are in those processes, the better off you will be in terms of demonstrating that your project is real and ready to proceed. Since all EOIs need to be submitted through our online portal, please go there as soon as possible to register for an account if you don't already have one. And if you do, go back and make sure you can still log on. Next, and I really can't emphasize this enough, please read the Call for Expressions of Interest Guidelines document. It's not a long document, and it answers most questions that we get on a regular basis. If you have a project that is not eligible or doesn't fit with this call for proposals, you can save yourself a lot of time and effort by reading the guidelines document carefully and figuring that out right away. It is important to review the evaluation criteria which are provided in that document. These criteria are used to evaluate and shortlist projects. Although there are different weightings for each of the criteria, all of the criteria are important, and all areas of the EOI template need to be addressed. Building on that point, when you're completing your expression of interest, it's important to use clear language and to address all points laid out in the template. Our evaluation team consists of subject matter experts, but if they can't decipher the information that's necessary to make a qualified assessment, or if the 10-page document is filled with extraneous information, they won't have the confidence to move the application forward in the process. Now, speaking of the 10-page limit, I think it's worth noting that you are welcome to include optional letters of support. These letters of support do not count as part of the 10-page limit and can be highly beneficial. These letters could come from key partners such as the local community or the host facility. Another piece of advice, do not wait until the last day to submit your application. If you do have technical issues during the submission process, our technical team is happy to help resolve these issues and is responsive to the requests that come in. However, I can tell you that if you wait until the last day, it's possible that we may not be able to address the last-minute issues that arise. Before I move to questions, I want to take a minute to talk about leveraging funding from our trusted partners. As Mark mentioned, ERA works in partnership with a number of funding organizations, such as Alberta Innovates, SDTC, and Natural Resources Canada. In some cases, there may be an opportunity for ERA to share your proposals with other trusted partners and explore the possibility to leverage funding available from these organizations. During the submission process, you have the opportunity to allow us to share your submissions with our trusted partners, and I encourage you to do so. If you agree to this in the system, ERA will only share your application with partners where we have a non-disclosure agreement in place and for the sole purpose of exploring further funding leveraging. Okay, now I'll throw things back to Isabella to moderate the Q&A.
Thanks for staying with us to learn about the new $50 million Circular Economy Funding Challenge. If you haven't already done so, please type your questions into the questions pane of the control panel, which is typically on your right-hand side of your screen. I'll also note that if you have questions specific about your project, please review the Expression of Interest Guidelines document And if you can't find the answer there, please reach out and someone from our technical team will be happy to chat after the webinar. So with that, we'll get to the first few questions that are rolling in. Justin, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about which TRL level or technology readiness level is eligible for this call.
Thanks. That's a great question. So ERA in general, and that includes this call, focuses on technology readiness level of 6 to 9. So that's projects where you're ready to have a pilot or demonstration up to the first in kind commercial deployment of a technology.
Thanks, Justin. Moving on to the next question here. Can a company send more than one application for different projects?
Yes, absolutely. There's no limit on applications per applicant, and that can include partnerships in a number of applications. But we do, as I said, we do get a lot of proposals, so we encourage you to prioritize your best opportunities.
Moving on to the next question, we spoke a little bit about the eligible projects and eligible types of technologies. Now, we won't go through the entire list of ineligible. You can find more of those in the guidelines, but there's a specific one on waste heat recovery. Are these projects eligible for this call?
No, waste heat recovery is treated the same as waste to energy or bioenergy projects, which are out of scope for this call. We have supported those types of projects in the past and will again in the future, just not in this call.
Thanks for that, Justin. Now, we have another question about partnerships. If the applicant has a partnership with a foreign entity, would this be eligible in this call?
Yes, absolutely, and actually encouraged. I mean, we recognize that climate change and circular economy are both global challenges that are faced around the world. So we're not naive to think that all the answers need to come from Alberta. We want to bring the best solutions from around the world here. As I mentioned, the project just needs to happen in Alberta.
Perfect. Now, we have another question about the one-to-one matching criteria. Can you please elaborate on this criteria and perhaps speak a little bit to the percent of government funds allowed for each project?
Sure. Yeah, I recognize that it's a little bit different for each funding organization. So we don't have a limit of total government funds per se, but every ERA dollar must be matched by a contribution from the private sector or the applicant. So, for example, you could have a project where you get 30% or 40% of the funding from another government agency, 30% from ERA, and then 30% from the applicants.
Thanks, Justin. Just building on that, I would say, just for everyone's benefit, that we don't, unlike some, particularly you see with the federal government funding initiatives, oftentimes there's a government stacking limit. Oftentimes it's 2/3 or 3/4. Our philosophy is the one-to-one matching, and the reason for that is to show that there's demand for the technology from some sort of private investor or industrial user or whatever the case may be. And so while we don't have a sort of a strict limit on government stacking, I would say that some questions will come up if, for example, project is $8 million or something like that, and you've got $1 million in private funding, $1 million request to ERA, and then the other $6 million is going to come from a federal funding organization. Some questions will come up around the demand and why such a large percentage of funding would come from government organizations. And so while there's no strict stacking limit, we do want to show, we want applicants to demonstrate that there's interest in this from the private sector.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Mark. Now, we had another question here about project scope. Wondering if it's beneficial to submit entire project scope that may include project goals or equipment that is not covered, while also having other costs that are, or should these items be removed from from the entire project scope if we know they're not covered in the guidelines?
Mark may want to add in on this one too, but I think our guidance is make sure that you clearly describe what the scope of the project is, but feel free to provide that broader context. And it can be beneficial to show that you've already done some work and are doing some ongoing work to bring this technology or innovation to market. So we are looking for that clear definition of the scope of the ERA project, but it doesn't hurt you to provide additional information on the other activities that are complementary to it. That being said, there is a page limit and you'll run out of space fairly quickly. So focus on the pieces that are specific to the project, and make sure you cover those fully first and then add in additional context as you see fit.
Justin, great answer. Now, for clarification, will you support researchers in college and university or post-secondary institutions, and what advice would you give to these applicants?
So yes, anyone is eligible to put forward a project or be part of a project. I think the advice to the academic researchers is make sure that your project meets all the eligibility criteria. So we're not looking at the raw research, the earlier technology readiness levels. We're really looking for deployment or demonstration of solutions. So researchers that want to be part of a project or have a project to put forward that fits those criteria are certainly welcome. And all proponents are encouraged to explore partnerships with Alberta's universities and research institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Just building on that last point very quickly, you mentioned earlier in the webinar, and we specifically say in the guidelines document that applicants are encouraged to partner with Alberta's post-secondary and research institutions, among others. And so what I would say is we've seen over the years, oftentimes those partnerships represent a really strong value proposition. And of course, post-secondary institutions, researchers are welcome to apply, but I wouldn't, I would consider even projects that are at a later stage of development with innovators partnered with an industrial operator, sometimes including post-secondaries and researchers can offer a lot of value to the outcomes of the project as well as to benefits for the province of Alberta.
Thanks both. Now, I'm just wondering if you can clarify the amount of funding allocated to a project.
Sure, yeah, for this call, the amount of funding is between $500,000 at the low end and $10 million at the high end. So your projects can certainly be much larger. We've had $100 million projects, but the maximum from us would be the 10 million.
Thanks, Justin. We had an interesting question here about feed studies. Given that we allowed feed studies in the carbon capture kickstart, will these be included or considered for very large CapEx projects with a high TRL?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I would say a very live topic of discussion in general. For this call, we're not looking to fund just a feed study. So a large project could certainly include a feed study as one of its early milestones, but we are looking for projects that actually go all the way through to deployment or demonstration of a innovation or technology. The carbon capture kickstart was specific to feed studies for a very particular reason, and that was related to the broader policy context, the upcoming and now released investment tax credit from the federal government, and the interest in deploying CCS at scale in Alberta. And we were looking to kind of accelerate that with a relatively small amount of ERA dollars contributing to those large scale projects. So that was a bit of a unique context, I would say, how we focused on feed studies for that call. In general, and including this call, we're open to including studies, but we don't fund studies as a standalone project.
Thanks, Justin. Going back to the EOI submission, how in-depth does the GHG accounting need to be in EOI versus FPP? What should applicants expect to submit?
Yeah, so have a look at the template and the guideline. We give some specific instructions there. In general, we're not looking for the full depth at the EOI stage, but we are looking for you to prove that there is a GHG reduction and that holds true both on a project basis and a life cycle basis. So more depth will be expected and a more in-depth review will be conducted at the FPP stage. For the EOI stage, it's sufficient to kind of clearly demonstrate that there's potential for that reduction, as I said, both at the project and life cycle basis.
Sorry, thanks, Justin. Maybe just building on that, I know you were alluding to it or mentioning the detail, the level of detail at the full project proposal stage, but maybe to put a little bit of a finer point on it in case applicants want to know sort of what to expect. At the full project proposal stage, we ask for a separate document, a greenhouse gas quantification report that goes into a fair amount of detail around the quantification methodology, around the baseline condition, around the project condition. And I will say that our greenhouse gas quantification team is happy to talk to applicants and happy to give a bit of a heads up and some guidance around the level of detail that will be required at the full project proposal stage. So we have this resource available, and I encourage folks, if they have specific questions about that, to reach out.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks,
Mark.
both.
The other thing I would add, sorry, Isabella, is if you're wondering about assumptions to make, like what grid factor to use or something like that, feel free to reach out to us. We do have some standardized assumptions that we use internally, so it sometimes helps to be consistent with those.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm wondering how we're defining project start. Is that shovels in the ground or design work or potentially even earlier? So what does that actually mean?
Yeah, good question. So that will vary a bit from project to project. It basically, we're asking you to define the scope of the project in your application. So what is considered project start will depend on that scope. So if the first milestone of your project is your feed study, and to go back to that previous question, then the initiation of that feed study would be the project start. And in terms of costs and eligible costs, you can start on some of that work now if you want, but ERA funding for eligible costs will only be starting after we sign the funding agreement.
Thanks, Justin. Maybe along those same lines, can you just go over sort of the length of the project? Are only projects that have a length of 3 years eligible for the call?
That's right. So the project, you can lay out the broader timeline of what you expect to do to bring your commercialization or your technology to market. But for the ERA purpose, we expect you to define a specific scope and timeline of the project, and that has to fit within that 3-year window.
I assume everyone knows this, but of course, just to make sure we're clear that projects that are shorter than 3 years are also perfectly acceptable as well. So we've seen in some cases projects get completed in 18 months with a maximum 3-year timeline, and that's totally fine as well.
Thanks both. So at what point in the process do we have to show proof of independent funding? Just going back to the matching criteria of 1-to-1.
I mean, intention versus proof is maybe a bit of a fine line. So we expect you to include a project budget and to include in that budget the portion that would be independent funding available for matching. You don't have to have that fully approved at the EOI stage. We'll certainly be looking for that as we go through our due diligence at the FPP and the absolutely at the contribution agreement stage. But I guess the further along you are, the better off your project will be. If it's kind of just, we hope to find funding, but we don't have any idea where we're going to go for that, that will not be considered very strong for the evaluation.
Thanks, Justin. Maybe just a quick question here on the type of funding ERA distributes, is the support available a non-repayable grant, interest-free loan, or other type of funding?
Yeah, great question. So currently, all ERA funding is a non-repayable grant. So it's non-dilutive funding. We don't take a stake in the technology or shares or ownership of the IP. It's a pure grant and for the purpose of accelerating the technology. Mark, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, it's Steve here. I thought I'd throw in something that's not often clearly understood about ERA funding. We're not an agency that provides you with a grant up front and say, see you later and let us know how it goes. Our funding is provided on a milestone basis. So the reality is that you need to have the funding in place to pay. You submit your eligible expenses to us, we review it, and based on that review of those expenses, we essentially refund you. And that builds on the question about when do we need our funding in place. If you don't have the cash in place to actually initiate your project, you won't be successful, because again, our funding is based on actual expenses and a refund of those expenses, not an upfront grant.
Thanks, Steve. That's a great clarification. And I guess maybe one further thing to add, all of our contribution agreements do include a holdback amount that is released once the final reporting has been completed. So again, the repayable on a milestone basis, and then a final release of a holdback at the end of the project.
So we mentioned that partnerships were encouraged in this funding challenge. What stage of partnership is ERA looking for? And would a partnership that's still in negotiation be acceptable at the EOI or FPP stage?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to communicate, intention or that you're under negotiation or that sort of thing for your partnership. Obviously, the more advanced it is, the stronger weight that'll have in the evaluation. But we recognize it's a relatively short window from announcement of a call to the deadline for the EOI, and that's part of why we have the two-stage process. Is that provides an opportunity for proponents to update us on the status of those partnerships as the process proceeds all the way through to the presentations in late fall of this year.
Thanks, Justin. Maybe just along those same lines, can multiple companies submit a single application as a partnership?
If I'm understanding correctly, absolutely, yes. And in fact, it's encouraged if there's opportunities for multiple partners, including multiple companies, to collaborate on a technology that often demonstrates the strength of interest in the market for a technology.
Maybe I'll jump in there a bit, because I think it's an important point in terms of the public good that comes out of these projects. And building on Justin's point around partnerships, that creates the conditions to share information, to learn based on multiple perspectives. Because one of the outcomes, and we mentioned it in the slideshow, was lessons learned. So our view is not so much that we've advanced the specific technology for a specific company, but based on the learnings from that project, we're able to share that with the marketplace in general, and that will accelerate the successes and also what doesn't work. So that's why we see the value of partnerships. The more diversity in the project in terms of the applications, the different business models, the skill sets brought to the project, we view that as an opportunity for greater learning and greater opportunity to actually accelerate the commercialization more broadly through the marketplace.
We have a couple questions here about our matching contributions and how the one-to-one matching works if multiple project partners are contributing to the projects. And along those same lines, what's the criteria for partner contribution? Is it cash only, cash and in-kind, or in-kind? How will that be viewed in the application?
Yeah, great question. So for the first part on the one-to-one matching, it's one ERA dollar to match one private dollar, so that private dollar can come from a combination of partners in a project. So it's all partners kind of lumped together in aggregate constitutes the private contribution that can be matched by ERA funding. In terms of in-kind versus cash, there's a specific guideline around eligible costs that I would encourage you to look at. Some forms of in-kind are eligible, and we certainly want all in-kind contributions to be noted in the budget, but not all in-kind contributions, such as staff time, are eligible for consideration towards matching.
And
So,
oh,
yeah,
sorry,
sorry,
Justin.
go ahead,
I
Mark.
was just going to add to that quickly and to put a little bit of a finer point on the first part around multiple partnerships and fund matching and reimbursement of funds. One of the things that'd be good for applicants to think about at this stage is that ultimately, whether it's a single applicant or a broader partnership or a number of organizations, in the end, if a project is approved for funding, ERA ultimately enters into a legal agreement we call a contribution agreement with one entity. So that's a bilateral agreement. So ultimately, there will be one entity that's essentially legally responsible for delivery of the project, and we have an agreement, as Justin talked about previously, that discusses the obligations as it relates to each party and the terms of the agreement. And so when there are multiple partners involved, those contributions are all toward the project. There will, in the end, be one entity that's responsible for delivery of the project and will receive the funds that are reimbursed from ERA.
Thanks both. We had a quick question about, if a project's underway before application or before a funding decision is made, how would that work?
So, yeah, I think I mentioned this, but maybe just to put a bit more detail on it. So it's fine to have completed activities, and obviously, we're looking at the later stages of technology readiness level. So that means you'll have to have done some prior work on the technology or maybe the project. So that's fine to report on and provide information on in the application. But we're looking for you to define a specific scope of project for ERA purposes. So that ERA project scope may be a subset of your broader project activities, and that scope of project and eligible costs within the ERA boundaries, that starts at project commencement. So we won't be costs that are incurred prior to commencement of the ERA specific project scope will not be considered eligible costs.
Thanks, Justin. Now, I know we mentioned a few examples on eligible types of technologies, and there are quite a few questions here about biofuel and bioenergy projects and waste to energy. Now, can you just clarify whether those would be eligible?
Sure, yeah, I saw that there's a few related to that. So I guess to start with the broad terms, waste to energy or waste products to energy related products such as biofuels or biogas for energy purposes are not eligible. Those can be, like, we recognize that sometimes these are complex systems and there could be a biofuel component to a technology, but the scope that ERA is looking at is more related to the materials use. So for example, you could have a biogas project where the input is biogas and then a portion of that is being sent for processing into bioplastics or as a biological feed to another industrial process that's not an energy related process, and another stream could be going to energy. So that's fine, but we're looking at the subset that is not energy related. And similarly on the waste heat, I saw a question about that. So of course, we recognize that throughout the supply chain, there is wasted energy in a number of places, and that can be an opportunity for emission savings. But for this call, we're not focused on the energy. We're focused more on the materials side of the supply chain.
And maybe just quickly, I'll mention, as Justin talked about earlier, it's not to say that those types of technologies don't fit within our portfolio and don't fit within our technology roadmap and our long-term strategy. In fact, going back to one of the earlier slides that talked about our cross-cutting technology areas, one of which is future fuels and another one is energy efficiency, and certainly some of these bioenergy, waste heat utilization and others would fit into some of these focus areas and will be addressed in other calls for proposals.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Justin. Just a quick question on project eligibility. Can a project which has already received ERA funding in the past, which is now complete, be eligible for this call if it is an additional improvement?
Yes. And in fact, again, it's almost encouraged that, we want to see technologies advance all the way through to commercialization. So if you had a prior project that may have been funded for us and it was, say, a pilot of a technology, and now you're ready for the first in kind commercial demonstration, we would love to see that. So as long as the project scope that is defined in your application has not been previously funded by us, then it is eligible. And it has to, I guess to follow on, it has to show that it's advancing the technology. So we don't want a repeat of a prior project. We're looking to advance it towards commercialization and deployment in the market.
Thanks, Justin. Now, in terms of budget changes or scope changes from EOI to FPP, how will this be dealt with, and what's the type of flexibility that applicants can see if their budget or scope changes between EOI and FPP stage?
Great question. Maybe pretty specific, but it's not uncommon to see some changes in scope or budget or partnerships or funding sources from as you're advancing your project towards the FPP, and even between FPP and presentation. So we want to have the best available information at each stage of evaluation. That being said, you can't do a full switch and say, oh, we got a DOI, but we actually want to do this totally different project that we think is a better idea and jump in at the FPP stage. Fairness is an important principle throughout the process. So natural evolutions or improvements of a project are fine, but if it's a wholesale change, you may be deemed ineligible at a later stage.
Thanks, Justin. Going back to the GHG portion of the EOI and FPP stage, we have a couple questions here on GHG benefit analysis. Can this be part of the project, or does this have to be defined prior to the project start? And maybe you can give a little bit more detail on what we expect out of applicants for their GHG analysis.
Okay, I'm not totally sure I understand the distinction, but I guess what I will say is the project scope that you are providing to us, we will be expecting you to quantify the greenhouse gas impact of that project scope, both on a kind of direct emissions basis as well as indirect and life cycle basis. But this is about advancing technology. So we recognize that sometimes a pilot or first demonstration may not have all of the efficiencies of the eventual commercial technology, and that's allowed for. So you can say, this is what we expect for the pilot, and then this is what we're working towards in terms of the impact of full commercialization. And when we quantify the emissions benefits of our projects, we quantify both the project level impacts as well as what we call market level impacts, which is a reasonable projection of what the impact will be if this technology is successfully proven and then deployed in the market in Alberta.
Thanks, Justin. I don't want to repeat what you said, but maybe just to reinforce, for us, core to our mandate is greenhouse gas benefits for the province of Alberta. And so when we go through the application process, we need to see very clear qualitative and quantitative analysis around what the potential for greenhouse gas benefits could look like. Now, and as Justin said, so I don't need to repeat him, that can be refined over the course of the project as we get further detail and understanding around the project. But simply said, we need to see a very clear justification that this will result in greenhouse gas benefits directly or indirectly or whatever the case may be during the proposal evaluation process.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Mark. We're almost out of time. We have some time for a couple more questions here. I think this one's important, and we talked a little bit about eligible technologies, but would a business model or process innovation be eligible versus a specific technology innovation?
Yes, so we define innovation broadly. It's not just about technology, but in the majority of cases, it will be technology. So it's up to you to kind of make the case that this is an innovation that needs support. But that could certainly include a business model innovation, and in the circular economy call, that's maybe particularly relevant. We're looking at addressing challenges like food waste, for example, where maybe it's not new technology that's needed, but it's a new system of thinking about the food distribution system that would divert those wastes from landfill to other more productive uses.
Thanks, Justin. Maybe just one more question here. Will the grant cover any project expenses already incurred in the past 12 months, or does it only cover upcoming expenses?
It only covers expenses that are incurred after the ERA scope of work is initiated. So feel free to report on those prior activities, as I said previously, but those are not considered eligible expenses. And I did see one question from somebody who joined late. All of the slides and the recording will be posted on ERA's website.
All right, so that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for your interest and your participation today. If you have unanswered questions after our webinar and after reviewing our supporting materials, please feel free to email us using applications@eralberta.ca, and one of our team members will be happy to help you.